because you can't really have a hierarchy of anarchists. It doesn't really work. And although we stand on the shoulders of giants, and they stood on shoulders of other giants, and, there's actually this great big pyramid of, giant anarchists, it's not really a terribly useful way of navigating the space. David Graeber is an American anthropologist who died a couple of years back, and I think he is the Elliott Smith of anarchism. And that is not because he's the first or even the best, although he was fucking good. But he was the one who broke our hearts. And he spoke to us in our language, which, being Generation X, is sound bites. I mean, he wrote, books and amazing books, and, did lecture, did all the professor things that professors do as well. But he had a particular talent for making really kind of emotionally potent missiles of meaning in very short sentences. And so he's the one who hooked me, basically. One of his sound bites, which I really like, is about bullying. Bullying involves three parties: the bully, the bullied, and the people looking on, allowing it to happen. I think that's really interesting, and once you twig to that, you see it everywhere you look. Whenever there's some sort of power asymmetry and somebody's lording it over somebody else, the power is not actually lying with the bully. The power is with the people watching and letting it happen. So that's what's happening with, Donald Trump at the moment has surrounded himself with this peculiar menagerie of diseased freaks who are taking advantage of his incompetence and his laziness, and the payoff he gets from that is they enable his bullying. Every billionaire sex offender is surrounded by a cocoon of sycophants who enable him to do what, billionaires so frequently seem to be doing these days. So I think that's a really, really interesting idea. And another one is, he once said that the indivisible unit of communism is from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, which I think comes from the Bible. And I think that's really interesting, not just for what it says, but as a template for thinking about other things. So, I first heard him say that about, 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been thinking about indivisible units of things ever since. Which brings us to next anarchist, and that is Sophie Scott Brown, who is an English philosopher, historian, and her thing is, aeroplane. Her thing is boring anarchism. It's everyday anarchism, and it boils down to, whenever there's a fork in the road, you choose the path that gives the most freedom. And I think that's great. My own take is that my solidarity is always with whoever is at the sharp end of a power asymmetry. And a power asymmetry usually expresses itself as somebody taking freedom from somebody else. And that's enabled by people looking on and letting it happen. So I really like her take on it. And her take on it is also to do with working from where people actually are right now. So it's not some sort of far-flung imaginary utopia or some set of philosophical ideals that nobody can possibly live up to. And you see a lot of that online. You see anarchists eternally arguing with each other, doing purity tests against each other, and I do not think that is helpful at all. In fact, I think it's probably a good idea not to start with theory at all. So her thing is to do with finding out where people are, well, they know themselves where they are, and taking the next best available step. And I think that is a really good way of looking at it. it is, it's like a meta thing. It's also a way of looking at it that gives people the freedom to actually do something. And it reminds me of Václav Havel, Czechoslovakian guy who wrote an essay called Power of the Powerless. And a lot of that was to do with tiny little acts of personal rebellion. Rebellion against the reigning hegemony of lies. Because each time you do a tiny little act of rebellion, you reinforce in your own head your own agency. It is empowering, personally empowering, just to do little things every day. And that can be, daft. The example I like is Lois, the old lady who lives next door to my dad, sometimes brings scones over. I think that's an act of anarchy. That is happening outside the reigning hegemony of everything needing to be for sale and everything being transactional and so on. Just little acts of kindness are enough. And if you're doing those, with the intent of, implementing, that's not the right word, but implementing your own agency, expressing your own agency, then that is actually quite empowering. So, Sophie Scott-Brown, I think she's great. Number 3 would swear blind that he's not an anarchist, but I actually think he's one of the most important anarchists that has ever lived. And he is David Snowden, who was a grumpy old Welsh wizard. A bit scary. And I think he's great. And what he has done is he has spent decades creating a physical, practical, real-world instantiation of Sophie Scott-Brown's philosophy to do with starting where people are and taking the next best step. You don't have goals, you have a sense of direction, and the sense of direction is, whatever gives the next most freedom. And he's done an incredible amount of work across an absolutely amazing amount of different, field tested across an incredible amount of different cultures, which sort of, to my mind, falls into 2 parts. One of them is mass parallel experiments without goals, but with a sense of direction. Small experiments that are safe to fail, and some of them need to fail because otherwise you're not testing the edges properly. So part of it is to do with navigating complex situations, and the other part of it is collecting feedback in real time from whole populations at scale. And the way he does that is he gets school kids to act as ethnographers to their own communities, and their own communities get to interpret their own stories themselves. There's no expert telling them what they're thinking or anything like that. And that's scalable globally. We could do that next year everywhere in the world if we wanted to. And I think that's, the way we're doing democracy at the moment, we're collecting 1 bit of information per citizen, 2 if you live in New Zealand, 1 bit of information per citizen every 4 years. And that's pathetic, for fuck's sake. We don't know how we are getting on as a population. And, we just get little glimpses of it every time we walk down the shops and there's people living in doorways. I think if we were able to reduce the degrees of separation between citizens, half of our problems would dissolve overnight. So he has said that anarchy always leads to tyranny, which sounds a bit like what Plato said about democracy, and we don't listen to that. So, but I think what he's done there is he's made a mistake in thinking that anarchism is some utopian end state rather than a sense of direction, rather than mass parallel experiments with a sense of direction, which is what I think it is. I don't think it can be anything else. Now, David Graeber once said that there's 2 Davids. There's a Dave ratio of 2 in this. Sorry, Sophie. David Graeber once said that utopias are great, but you've got to have more than one of them. And I think that's absolutely right, because if you've got one utopia, the context around it's going to change eventually, and it is going to become a bit of a nightmare. It'll be a square peg in a round hole. So, yeah, I think David Snowden, I think he's one of the most important thinkers in the world today. And, and it's all scientifically based, and, he takes a very cynical scientific look at it. I actually... what he's doing is like a scientific version of what Roger Hallam, the Extinction Rebellion guy who just got out of prison, is doing. And I would really like to see those two kind of work together, but they're both cantankerous old British blokes. So I think they'd probably just try and out-cantankerize each other. They'd be like two cross old cats sitting next to each other, like refusing to countenance the others. But having everything in common and, actually being the greatest of friends, they would just never admit it. Four would also say that he is not an anarchist, and I'd be inclined to agree. And that is Ian McGilchrist. And what Ian McGilchrist has done is he has written 2 books about that thick each, and with bibliography, like references at the back that are like bigger than most paperback books, to do with the way different brain hemispheres do attention. And the left does goal acquisition and the right does situational awareness, and we need both. Without situational awareness, you don't know what's going on. Without goal acquisition, you don't get anything done. So they're both absolutely vital, but the goal acquisition part has a horrible tendency of thinking it knows what's going on and blundering into things and fucking it all up. The goal acquisition part doesn't experience reality directly. It works off a fitness map, like an internal, reality map. And that is vital. There's like a scientist called Donald Hoffman who says that he has a game theoretic proof such that organisms that don't work off fitness maps will always go extinct. And I think that it's quite possible that there is game theoretic proof for us having different brain hemispheres that perform these 2 different roles. And I would not be at all surprised if aliens turned up and they had 2 brain hemispheres as well. I think it's possibly a universal. And the reason I think that is important, because it's incredibly powerful as a framework of metaphor. I'm actually less interested in the brain hemispheres than the framework of metaphor, because when you look at things, through that lens, a whole lot of things make sense that didn't previously make sense. Like, for example, if I pick something up and put it down somewhere and I can't find it, which happens at least once a day, searching for the thing, you employing the goal acquisition thing, where I'm not actually experiencing reality directly, I'm running off a fitness map, is a really, really inefficient way of finding it. And the best way of finding things that I've lost is to tidy the place up, because that employs, situational awareness. And it's just easier to see things when you're tidying things up than if you're actually searching for them. And it also reflects on the way that we are doing politics at the moment, particularly fascism, because fascism is really, really hung up on masculinity. I don't know that you've noticed, but it is. And I think that it's a lot more helpful to frame that as goal acquisition rather than masculinity. What's that Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will? Fascists think that action is a virtue for its own sake. They will always put action over reason, over perception, over finding out what's going on. But if you reframe it as modes of attention, knowing that both of them are absolutely vital for survival, then you've suddenly got a framework where it's not a person that's at fault, it's a type of thinking that's at fault. And they are not 100% wrong for thinking that way. It's a way of dealing with people without instantly turning them into enemies. So, and it's actually, it also says something kind of really beautiful, I guess, about the human condition. So I've got a lot of time for that guy. And he also said that anarchy always leads to tyranny. And I think he is also falling into the trap that he is saying other people fall into by using a reality map to understand the situation, which is far more complex than that. You know, it's not an endpoint, it's a sense of direction. And David Snowden thinks he's talking a load of nonsense. And I have a lot of sympathy with that suspicion, because I think there is a danger with Ian McGilchrist's framing of this to become a really rigid reality map in its own right, where people are made right or wrong, you know, according to whether they're using this part of the brain or that part of the brain. You know, I can see it turning into a cult, McGill Christianity. Because like cults have, you know, often have this sort of internal vocabulary within which dissent is impossible. And I can see McGill Christianity turning into that. So I think David Snowden is right to be suspicious, but I think he is throwing a whole lot of baby out with not very much bathwater. And it's worth keeping this perspective in mind because, you know, 1 point of perspective is worth 80 points of IQ. And I think it's amazingly powerful. And David Snowden's thing where he is navigating complexity with mass parallel experiments, his goal acquisition and his using children as ethnographers in their own communities, his situational awareness, he is in Ian McGilchrist's world, whether he likes it or not. So yeah, that's that guy. And the next one is sort of unusual because there's two of them. It's fifth equal, and they are John Milton and William Blake. And the reason I like those and the reason I think they are important is because they created this vast poetic superstructure for romanticizing and forgiving and for allowing rebellion. And I think, you know, the 1960s would not have looked like the 1960s without those two guys, and the internet would not have freedom built into its DNA without the hippies in the 1960s who built it. I mean, it's been hideously abused today, but, you know, and there's a lot of different people that could, you know, fill those shoes, like Giordano Bruno or, you know, Dante Aguilera or Jesus. But yeah, I like those two. And I also like to, you know, use those as examples because the scientific approach is indivisible units of things. You know, we understand things by looking at smaller and smaller and smaller kind of units. And that is not the only approach. Another way is to go in the other direction and make, you know, the biggest sort of informational or metaphorical or poetic, artistic superstructure that you can. And I'm partly coming at this as an artist. It's not just a scientist. And I think if I'm going to go really high up, I think we are headed into a war against Skynet. And it's not going to be clanking robots with laser beams crushing human skulls. You know, I mean, that movie was, you know, a reenactment of World War II, basically. It is going to be over human brains as substrate. And I think the war against Skynet and, you know, the war in heaven and the war against fascism or whatever are all the same war. And like Václav Havel, I think that the front line in the war in heaven is not going to be in the fields or in the streets or on the beaches or in the landing grounds. It is in the minds of every citizen, and I think it is there. I think it is going to be won by creating a synthesis between the two modes of attention that the two different brain hemispheres do. So there you go. Okay, so that's my 5 arranged in height, and I think you deserve if you've lasted this long, you deserve a bonus, Anarchist, and that is Alan Moore. So go on YouTube and search for Alan Moore anarchism, and you'll find a little 2-minute video where you're sitting there saying 99.9999% of the world's problems. And I think he is gorgeous. I think he's so cool. And he also got me interested in anarchism, possibly before David Graeber did. So good on you, mate. Thank you. Bye.